I'm Kyle with Fundamentals of Finance, and welcome to my introduction to inflation, where I'll take you through the basics of what it is and why you should care. And for those interested, I'll go deeper into how it's calculated, what impacts it, and the role that the Federal Reserve, or Fed, plays in it. I'm not going to use any terms here like cost push or demand pool inflation, because I'm not a textbook and this is not your high school economics class where you're forced to memorize terms you'll soon forget and never use again. At Fundamentals of Finance, I use real everyday terms to explain topics that really matter to real everyday people. So in this video, I hope to give you a deeper understanding of what inflation is and why it matters to everyday people. And then in subsequent videos, we'll dive deeper into its impacts on stocks, bonds, and other types of investments like crypto and gold. Put simply, inflation is just a measure of how things get more expensive over time. If you buy food, gas, or really anything, you can feel the price of inflation impacting your wallet over time. Remember when gas was $1 a gallon? Perhaps I'm dating myself, but you get the point. So inflation is a measure of how prices rise over time. And you should care because you pay those prices when you buy things. But it's a bit more complex than inflation is 3%, so the price of everything goes up 3% each year. So if you already know the basics we've gone through already, here's where you might learn something. There are lots of measures of inflation, but for this video, we'll focus on the most common one, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The CPI is quite complicated if you really dive into the weeds, but at a high level, it's based on price rises in 8 broad categories: food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education and communication, and other goods and services. There's also a commonly referenced measure called core CPI, which is the same thing but without food and energy prices, since they tend to be really volatile. AKA they move around a lot and mess with the numbers sometimes. This may be a good time to get into some of the factors that can impact inflation, which are very wide ranging, but I'll do my best to cover the major ones here. I'm recording this in April 2022. Right now is a great example of why they don't count food and energy prices into core CPI. During COVID-19, energy companies didn't invest much in new production capacity. And then as the pandemic subsided and factories increased their operating hours while people started driving and flying again, the demand grew faster than the supply could keep up with, leading the price of oil and thus gas at our pumps to go up a lot. Then the war in Ukraine broke out, with Russia being a key supplier of oil to the world. The US and UK stopped importing oil from them, and their biggest customer, Europe, is considering doing the same, which would lead to an even larger oil supply shortage. This is part of the reason why inflation, or CPI, has been so high lately, and why energy prices aren't counted in core CPI. Like many other things in financial markets, inflation really comes down to supply and demand. It's just aggregated across those broad categories since they aren't all impacted by the same amount at the same time. Technology can actually be deflationary in some products, for example. Remember how much TVs used to cost? You can get a nicer one today for $1,000 than you could a few years ago for $3,000. But for most things, prices generally go up over time. If you remember the 8 categories that we mentioned earlier, really anything that impacts supply or demand in any of those categories can impact inflation. We talked about energy already, but for one more quick recent example, let's look at housing. During the pandemic, we had 2 things impact the price of housing. First, interest rates hit all-time lows. Since most people borrow money to buy a house, lower rates allow people to buy more expensive houses for the same monthly payment, because the interest rate expense on the loan will be lower. Often that makes housing prices go up, which is what happened. At the same time, everyone's spending so much time at home that allowed people to want to work on their houses, which led to an uptick in demand for lumber and caused a price spike. That also increased inflation. You can see how many things can impact inflation in many ways. One last area we'll cover, which can have really broad impact, is currency. Now, a deep dive on currency will probably warrant its own video at some point, but for inflation purposes, a weakening currency can increase inflation or vice versa. So just to reiterate to make sure it's clear, a weakening currency can increase inflation, but increasing inflation can also weaken a currency. So it's a bit of a chicken or egg scenario. If a country imports a lot of stuff and their currency is getting weaker, that makes the stuff from other countries more expensive. So for example, let's say $1 is worth 7 Chinese yuan. If we want to import some Chinese toys that each cost 1 yuan, we can get 7 of them for $1. Let's say the US dollar weakens against the yuan, and now each dollar is only worth 6 yuan, not 7. Well, if the price of the toy stays the same in China, we can now only afford 6 of them for $1 when we used to be able to buy 7. Or put differently, 7 toys used to cost $1, and now 7 toys would cost us $1.17. That's inflation driven by a weakening currency, which would only impact imported goods or goods with imported components. But for a wealthy country like the US, that's a lot of them. Higher inflation can also cause a currency to weaken. Again, this comes down to supply and demand. Let's say a lot of foreign investors own US bonds, which is true. Most bonds pay a fixed return and you get a fixed amount of money back at some future date. So if inflation is high and the dollar is getting less and less valuable over time, foreign investors might not want to stay invested in something that's losing value. So rising inflation can cause foreign investors to pull their money out of a country. That selling activity, or falling demand if you will lead to a weakening currency. So inflation is all around us. It impacts almost everything we buy, and often we don't even realize it's happening. So how do we keep it from getting out of control? That's where the Federal Reserve, or Fed, comes in.
And of course, the big issue that we're very focused on is inflation and getting inflation back down to our 2% goal.
That's the central bank in the US, and their job is essentially to make sure the economy and financial markets function smoothly, which means keeping inflation tamed. For an example of what can happen when inflation is not kept in check, look no further than the Venezuelan Bolivar, which reached an inflation rate of over 65,000% in 2018. To put in that perspective, that means that if your favorite sandwich at your local sandwich shop cost 10 bolivares on January 1st, it would have cost 650,000 bolivares by the end of the year. The money became so worthless that people started making art out of it, because it was worth more that way than if you actually spent it. We'll dive deeper into the Fed in a separate video, but for our purposes here, one of their most important functions is to keep scenarios like that from happening here in the US. And one of the ways they do that is by raising interest rates when inflation starts to get too high. Remember, inflation is just a complicated measure of demand being too high relative to supply across a basket of goods, which causes the price of those goods to rise. So raising rates curbs demand. But we'll get to that in a second. The Fed does not actually control all interest rates, but they do set a benchmark known as the Fed funds rate, which for simplicity's sake is the rate at which banks lend to each other. Since these loans are usually among large, stable institutions and the money is lent for just one day, the Fed funds rate sort of functions like a minimum. When it goes up, other interest rates often do as well, especially shorter term, higher quality ones. That makes it more expensive to borrow money. Businesses can't expand as much, it's hard to get consumers to get loans, and that reduces the amount of overall spending. This environment, with the Fed raising rates, is known as a tightening credit cycle. Think of a scenario where you had to fix something on your car and you had to tell your friends, sorry, can't go to that concert next weekend. Money is tight right now. The Fed raises rates, which makes it harder and more expensive for businesses and consumers to borrow money, so they spend less. AKA their demand for goods goes down, and that cools off the inflationary price rises. If there are 100 pairs of Nikes available and 150 people want them, Nike can charge higher and higher prices until 50 people are no longer interested. Too much demand relative to supply leads to inflation. If money is tight, not as many people will want to spend money on the new Nikes, so they won't be able to raise prices as much. Inflation subsides. So that's why it's called tightening, and it's called the credit cycle, because credit means borrowing money, and cycle refers to the fact that this goes in waves. They raise rates or tighten credit for a while, then inflation cools off, then maybe we enter a recession and they lower rates, or ease credit to make it easier to borrow and stimulate the economy. We'll do a deeper dive on the Fed at some point in the future if y'all are interested, but for now, I hope you've gotten a better understanding of inflation. To recap, inflation is just a measure of how much prices are rising over time, which is commonly measured by the CPI, or Consumer Price Index. Inflation can be impacted by many factors, but in the end, it mostly comes down to supply and demand for the goods that make up the CPI. The Fed raises or lowers interest rates so inflation doesn't get out of control and you never have to pay $650,000 for a sandwich or make art out of your $100 bills. As part of our series on inflation, please check out my other videos currently in the works on how inflation impacts stocks, bonds, and other investments. If you really want to learn more about investing, check out my free webinar below titled The 9 Habits of Successful Investors. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching, and if you learned something, please give this video a like, and please subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss any investment videos. See you in the next video.